Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to another Ancient Civilizations lecture video by Mr. Hicks. Today's topic is the Yellow River, which is the river valley located in ancient China. That'll be the topic of focus for today. So, as always, we're going to start with what this place is about. Just so you're aware that many consider the Yellow River civilizations to be the foundation of Asian culture, or at the very least Chinese culture. And Chinese culture has spread quite widely in various time periods, so that's why it's often considered a foundation. These are some more, modern pictures of the place. I'm not exactly sure when modern is. I'm under the impression this is closer to when the dams opened. Anyways, let's go into the modern day references. First off, dams. There are a number of dams, such as the Yellow River Dam and Three Gorges Dams, and these are some of the largest projects ever done for dam building. There are some concerns. I need to check to see if these concerns are still valid, but there's a lot of water in the Yellow River system, and there's some concern that, at least there was a few years ago, that without modifications, there could be a water problem. Which, one of the things you'll realize in a lot of history is the displacement of water is really important. People fight and die for it. For example, take Mesopotamia. Flooding will occasionally destroy things. There's a lot of those flooding myths. And so if you've got too much or not enough, you're probably going to have a problem with water. Anyways. Right now, also, pollution is a problem on the Yellow River. We have this term biologically dead, and cancer rates are much higher. But that's kind of the modern day references to the Yellow River. But rolling on through, let's go back in time to the basics. Who are we talking about? The Yellow River initially starts out as some farming communities that'll gradually grow more and more complex. That's kind of the trend we see. Is there's this archaeological trend that shows people show up. They don't farm at first, then they start farming, then they start organizing into bigger and bigger communities, and that's when we get what we would consider civilizations that we talk about in this class. The location is along the shores of the very dangerous, muddy Yellow River. It is the muddiest river in the world, 3 times that of the mighty Mississippi. It just produces a lot of mud, and so when you get flooding, sometimes you get a lot of mud flooding. And so while this mud is very deadly and dangerous, it's also very helpful. Because all that mud is fresh silt, fresh soil for growing. And especially before the era of crop rotations, this is the easiest way to keep your soil fresh, is to, get a ton of it dumped on your lands periodically. So here's where that Yellow River is. There are other rivers. It's not the longest river, to my recollection. But this is the one where civilizations seem to set up. And here's a map in Chinese with a better screen resolution. It's prone to very violent flooding. That's why the Communist Party built the dams that I mentioned before. Is the flooding and the death and destruction in Chinese histories. They refer to it often as the River of Sorrow, because the flooding would bend the river in different directions and it would destroy entire settlements. In fact, we have documentation of this dating back to 602 BC. It indicated that the river had changed course 26 times, flooded over 1,500 times, and killed millions. For example, in 132 BC, one of the emperors, that was their entire rule, was rebuilding after a particularly damaging flood. That was the entirety of their rule. They didn't get much else done because they were so busy trying to rebuild afterwards. Anyways, let's talk about when. This is where things get a bit confusing. There are, in Chinese legend, so Chinese pop culture, there'd be a ton of references. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, that kind of, and older. So one of the things we run into is there's kind of this mythic idea of China, and then there's the China we have archaeological evidence for. That's the word I'm looking for. Agricultural evidence is usually the yeah. Anyways, carrying on. But now we've got the Shang Dynasty. Later on, we have this one. But we'll talk about how the dynasties transition, because that's kind of important. The Chinese believe it's one large continuous cycle. So we'll look at that. Now let's look at how the rule is, and this is where it brings up one of those new ideas. So in the previous, in Mesopotamia, we learned about city-states. The form of government organization that we see in China is feudalism, where essentially local lords would pledge loyalty to bigger, more important leaders and more important leaders. And you had this chain of connections. And often the local rulers were the heads of clans, which were groups of families with a common ancestor. The reason for this setup is it allows for very localized responses to issues. So when you have a feudalistic setup, you have a very active local government, and they will often be called in to serve for the larger portions of the government. And so if we ever get to the medieval ages, you'll learn about how complicated that can get. But in China, we see the use of feudalism and clans as the way of organizing their society, their farming communities. So, rolling on through. Let's go into some notable accomplishments. We've got something called the Mandate of Heaven, and this was an idea that the rule of the kingdom was determined by the ancestors and the gods. Essentially, a ruler that had the Mandate of Heaven was considered a right ruler. They were doing right by the people. They were doing right to protect their lands, and prosperity was good. But the Mandate of Heaven could be lost if an emperor and their successors lost sight of ruling wisely, if they were weak defending against barbarians. You could lose the Mandate of Heaven. Here's what the Mandate of Heaven leads to what we would call the Dynastic Cycle. And so what happens is you've got an old dynasty, they've raised the taxes, the people are ignored, the roads and the canals aren't being maintained, the flood walls aren't being maintained, and people are just treated poorly. And so this is reflected through floods, earthquakes, peasant revolts, invasions, bandits roving the countryside. Essentially, when farmers figure, well, I can't make a go of things, I might as well turn to robbing others, you get bandits. Political instability promotes bandit behavior. And so a new group will rise up, a successful revolution will claim the Mandate of Heaven. And essentially, to be the one with the Mandate of Heaven, you bring about peace, you begin building projects, you make sure that the peasants have land to farm, and you make sure that those peasants can farm in relative peace. And that's how you get the Mandate of Heaven back, and that's how the Dynastic Cycle, dynasty referring to a ruling family, that's how you change them out. And so Mandate of Heaven can be won or lost, and it's done through actions and expressed through disaster. Another concept that's really important, and it's been alluded to, is Yellow River civilizations have immense respect for ancestors. This respect came out of the understanding that recalling ancestors was done in hopes of bringing better harvests, victory in battle, and safety on their descendants. It was kind of believed that the ancestors acted in their best interest, And so by honoring and revering them, you were ensuring that the cycle continues. One of the things you'll see with Chinese ancient civilizations is this cyclic nature, this circle. But we'll see it. We'll see it. Later on. It's reflected through other things as well. So that's what's the idea behind this. The early Chinese in the Yellow River discovered the use of silk, taking the string from the silkworm and making it into a very lightweight fabric. Silk would be a rare, valuable commodity for centuries. Europeans wouldn't figure out how to make it until the 1400s. And the substitute rayon wouldn't be developed until much, much, much later. So that's one of the other things we see with the ancient Yellow River Valley civilizations. The reason why I'm kind of referring to them collectively is because they all kind of build off of each other, and we'll go into more detail in class about the different specific of each of the dynasties. Here's some picture of some silk. We're also going to see the foundation of a couple of philosophies. Some people will even take some of them into religion as well, but we'll look at them in more detail. Confucius is a good example. You can already see where Confucius is coming from, the ancestor respect, the dynastic cycle. If you had to sum up Confucius into a nutshell, harmony through order. Confucius is all about establishing order. And why do we establish order? Because it creates harmony. So, and then we've got Taoism or Taoism. If you're wondering about the spelling differences of the two, it has to do with how it's translated into English. Early translators used, the earliest translators were Jesuits, and they didn't translate into English, they translated into Latin. And so Latin spellings and English spellings don't run eye to eye. Anyways, we have a more naturalistic focus on in Taoism, focused more on nature and taking the natural course of things. So while Confucius says, how can we organize society, Taoism will basically say, how is going with the flow going to make the difference? But we will cover those in more detail in the class period itself. Anyways, that's it for now, and until later.